Hi, JMcL here. I'm here to talk about professional development concerning the composer. What I will be saying is just really based on my own personal experience, therefore it's my personal point of view, and it perhaps is also the advice that I wish that somebody had told me when I had just finished my first degree or early into my postgraduate studies. So, at the moment you're probably concerned with just fleshing out your portfolios, and you may be thinking, I'm just going to concentrate on writing more music and that's it as far as professional responsibilities go. But sooner or later you're going to be interacting with performers and other people, and you have to confront the question, how serious are you? And how do you put across a sort of professional front, first of all? So there's two aspects to this professional element at the very start, and they are time management and interpersonal skills, just in a broad sense. So for example, with composing itself, you have to manage your time. Writers and painters and composers, generally speaking, they wouldn't do 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, but they would have those days mapped out where they are definitely free for a decent block of hours, whatever that might be, 2 or 3 days on which a good block of time is available, during which they make themselves compose. You don't just sit around waiting for inspiration, of course. Tchaikovsky said something, didn't he, about his muse was very well trained to meet him at 10 o'clock in the morning or whatever it was. So that's one thing about time, just composing. But there's a lot of ancillary work which also needs timetable to time. You might be doing just the patient editing work of a score, which is quite tedious and not creative. So in terms of non-creative work, score presentation, the printing and binding and posting, but also maybe some form filling or dealing with people by email, which you really need, again, to set aside a half a day a week, probably roughly something like that, to do once you're out there in the real world. And the second point that I made was about interpersonal skills. Not everybody really likes any cold calling, I guess it used to be called. You do need to find out about who people are in terms of managers, curators and musicians, of course, and you need to be able to approach them either in person at concerts or just from a cold email, and you need to be quite good at following those kind of things up. So, a brief word about equipment. A composer, to be organised, needs to have a sort of virtual office, which nowadays is not much more than a laptop with good Wi-Fi in most cases. But you would tend to gradually accumulate other things, and if you're lucky, or over the years, you get more desk space, maybe have a printer and a scanner and paper on hand. I mean, I would actually have such a thing as a binder in order that I can make decent comb-bound scores, which of course are printed. And as well as that, another element of equipment would be things like musical instruments. So if I'm writing for guitar, I would actually try the shapes out on a guitar, and obviously you see a piano. I can't play any other instruments, but anyway. So audio and video recording devices as another element, which again, well, you're pretty soon going to need something like this. This is a H4, more modern looking ones look better than that nowadays, and it's a digital card thing with excellent audio quality. And when you're messing around with looking for excellent audio quality, you're going to be wanting to hear it back properly on the best headphones that you can afford. Again, that's something that I only just recently acquired those ones, so many years into things. It's important under the heading knowing stuff to know why you compose. A very tricky question, but you will need to think, how is your music relevant to the world? Is it in any sense necessary to the wider world? How come did you choose the style that you compose in? Is it in any way unique? If you really want to be unique, you need to know a lot of really recent work, anything, very recent work plus work from anything up to 60 years ago. After all, if you think about excelling in any field, say a scientific or technical field, you would need to be up to date with research and development, and also aware of recent developments as you go through the years, as you age through the decades. You still have to keep abreast of things. So I've heard many composers, including myself, advocate the philosophy of lifelong learning. After all, what's the worst thing that could happen? You could end up writing a relatively medium or mediocre version of something that somebody else, somewhere else, is doing a really excellent job on. So that would be, something you don't want. So, keep learning. It's perfectly possible to combine institutional study, I mean like a postgrad degree or a degree or whatever in composition, with private study at the same time, or do private study afterwards, which is actually what I did, I think. Because the best learning opportunities for composers tend to be in one-to-one type scenarios like you're having in the summer school at the moment, and maybe on a longer term than that, So I mean, you could actually, I myself looked up a composer and arranged one-to-one lessons privately, paying, and it went on over months, and a couple of those, in fact. Obviously, the other kind of learning you can be doing is short courses like this, and even shorter things such as workshops. And I would also advocate that you continue to study scores on your own, and that you, where possible, meet other composers and talk about solutions to problems and experiences. Listening, obviously, is terribly important. There's no point in being the sort of composer who writes stuff but never listens to anybody else at all. After all, you want an audience, so if you're not capable of being an audience, it's pretty strange, to say the least. Where are you going to hear interesting music that's genuinely artistically relevant? Well, that's a big question, of course. I would say, the obvious things. My favourite answer to this really is that it's a live medium, and if you can get to contemporary music concerts, that's the best thing. Look out for festivals near you, and there are other places such as online. There's an excellent YouTube channel called Score Follower, which you may not be aware of, but it's great because it does seem to be very well curated, which is the important thing, because there's so much stuff, you just don't know if any of it's any good sometimes if you're just clicking at random. So it's nice when a space like that is well curated. And if you have friends who you think have great taste, find out what they're listening to in their collections, as it were. Anyway, as regards lifelong learning in the listening department, there's another area which is obviously important to composers, which is to develop your ear. You need to develop a comprehension and imagining of pitch elements, timbre elements, textures, harmonic qualities, and even the drama of a piece. In other words, you need to be able to hear a piece that isn't written down yet. You need to be able to hear that in your head and hopefully go and write it down as well. So those are technical skills that you would keep sharpening. I would expect that at the end of a degree, most people wouldn't have finished sharpening those kind of skills, and I would advocate carrying on. Looking at scores is incredibly helpful for things like how on earth do we write down these kind of mad rhythms or whatever it is, all sorts of things. You also need to develop memory in the sense that musical memory, concentration, listening to a long piece. Does your mind wander? You can train yourself out of that. And when you're a composer, you do need to have the same concept of your piece for weeks or months. So you need to be able to come back after 3 days break or when life gets in the way and sit down, and there you are, still writing the same piece, knowing exactly what you wanted next, and so forth. So of course that's a form of training which you will learn with experience. It's not as bad as it seems, and that's where extra musical ideas really come in as a support, by which I simply mean it could be moods, it could be that your piece is meant to be portraying a particular dramatic situation, or that you have textures roughly sketched out in English, and then you can come back to look what your ideas were, and your mind will come back to the kind of creative flow that you were in when you wrote those things down, and you're straight in there. I would advocate other wider learning, that you learn about life and art, and I do mean like the arts, whether it's cinema or visual art, or I don't know what other arts you might consider sound art and so forth. And I would even advocate, a good mathematical grounding, but you may be past that stage. Anyway. There's such a thing as the finish of a score. A score that is well finished will come across as coherent and consistent, and to other people, judges or performers looking at it, it looks like a piece of music. It doesn't just throw up a bunch of questions straight away. So remember that your score is a tool of communication, and put efficiency as your watchword. The basics here are to avoid obvious questions and problems coming from performers mainly. So does your score have an indication of tempo, or maybe several of those as it goes along, and the mood maybe, certainly dynamic markings, articulations, and maybe rehearsal marks and so forth. And then again, you probably will be making parts, so those parts should have neat page turns and generally neat layout, because you usually have to adjust that within a program. If you switch from a score straight to parts pane, it's not going to look good until you've pulled things around. So you're always going to have to do extra layout on the parts, and sometimes it's very fiddly. You have to maybe save a version of the score that is the version for the violin part, and then you maybe have another copy of the score which goes for the next part, and so forth. When it comes to score submissions, or presenting your score, or sending your score to performers and so forth, a score should of course have on the front the name of the composer, the year it was composed, the approximate duration, and then alongside that, possibly in separate files, or possibly inside the score as the next page, you would include a biographical note and a program note for that piece. And again, have the parts ready to go. Sometimes these things are going out as a PDF and they don't want the parts, but of course it just depends. You would want to read the instructions if you're in a situation where it's a submission calling for a score. It may say do not send parts yet, or it may say send the score on parts. So you always check what is asked for in applications and opportunities. There's also something else in scores nowadays, which would be what we call the legend, or there's other ways of referring to it, I'm sure, a sort of lead sheet where any peculiar notations are given in a table and explained. I have one here, and I hope to put it on the screen as well, but this is sort of the idea. I'm not going to go through any of that, but I mean, it's just that there might be strange noteheads, or there may be graphic things you've put in to tell the performer to do a particular effect. Now I'm going to talk about performers. I'm going to start with the idea that you're already at a rehearsal. This is the easy part, of course. Performers will ask you questions. There'll always be something in your score, despite what I said a minute ago, that they need lots of further clarification on, and so forth. They might say, oh well, do I start with an up bow or a down bow on this phrase mark? All sorts of things. But what matters really is that you are decisive and that you give an answer. So in other words, you either have to be sure or act sure. So in other words, if they say, do you want this or this, pick one anyway, even if you cannot hear the difference. Above all, just don't bumble and mumble. We all do a bit of that, but I mean, just generally speaking, try and approach the thing with confidence, and they're only human. They're not going to bite your head off. Rehearsals are usually, almost always, either the same day as the concert or the day before. So, what are you going to be telling them at a rehearsal? You really need to stick to broad things. You cannot give them 27 changes. They're very good at adapting a last-minute change, but there are limits, and usually what I find that I try to do in those rehearsals is get the big picture items. Very often the tempo is not even what you put on the score. I always have a metronome on my phone, and I say, well, this is actually, what the tempo is meant to be this. Of course, you're super polite, of course. And the other thing would be simply the level of the mood or the energy, which is dynamics. So very often, something that they can pencil in where you say, oh, you see that F, mark it as FF actually, and gives a bit more guts there, whatever. Or it might be, you're sticking out way too much, far too expressive solo there. Just make it, more casual, and let the others be heard. So these broad things, which really affect, your enjoyment as a composer, don't be backwards and coming forwards with those. And their broad things are easily taken on board by musicians, and they love the fact that you are telling them that stuff, because that's exactly the stuff they want. Now, the other more difficult thing is, how do you get to that rehearsal? If you go around finding performers at the end of concerts, it's very tricky, obviously. And I will say one thing, that in my experience, nearly all performers that I come across are really nice people, and they almost invariably say, yeah, let's work together sometime. And then that's it, and off you go. So where do you go from there? Because I will tell you that they're not going to call you then the next day or any other time, ever. But if you get back to them and say, okay, how are we going to make that happen? So you need to have concrete proposals, and it has to be realistic from the get-go, so you have to pick people carefully that you feel might do it. One of the key aspects to that is, if you have a visiting soloist who is a star of contemporary music, and you do this trick of approaching them at the end of the concert, it's probably not going to come off, because, well, basically my advice is a good working thing is to say, pick performers who are sort of at the same career level as you are right now. So that's pretty tricky for us young composers. But there are young performers out there that you should hopefully have colleagues in your institutions, and that's the obvious place to start at the beginning and so forth. But there are lots of performers in Ireland who have a track record in contemporary music, so obviously that's the other thing. You want your performers, pick performers who have a track record in the field, and not just performers of dead composers. I would avoid, in fact, performers who really play romantics and classics and the like, and never really play anyone cutting edge at all. So basically, do not expect approaches from performers. Do not expect commissions from performers, at least not to come out of the blue. You have to make that stuff happen. For example, I have been known to get commissions, and most of the time it's been a development of a relationship where I've said, how do you fancy this? And we have to talk about where would the concerts be. I have to have answers to that, suggestions, and use my own contacts about venues and so forth. And then a piece might have 2 or 3 performances lined up before it's written. And then I might go for funding to the Arts Council and go for the commissioning scheme, where the composer ends up virtually filling in the entire form, and they might just sign the end. But everybody understands where they are. They know that this is a genuine commitment. In fact, the money will go into their account as a commissioner, and so forth, and they will pay you. So you have to be very professional about all that sort of thing. And you would be saying the forces and the duration, and you would have, as I say, a few concerts lined up that are real, not some sort of fantasy. Other things you can do to promote your work and head towards that rehearsal I mentioned would be, setting up meeting with artistic directors and curators. Anybody that you know, that you see is a decision maker. If you find a small-scale contemporary music festival and so forth, you need to figure out who's the right person to talk to, and don't waste time talking to the wrong people. Obviously you can look at opportunities online. There are places like composersite.org, is it? And opportunity pages such as on the Contemporary Music Centre website, But I would say that when you're looking at those kind of opportunities, that you think, oh great, somebody in Germany or Denmark or France wants a piece for violin and marimba, I'll just knock one out. The chances of them actually playing your piece are pretty slim, because generally speaking local works better than global, and they have composers in their locality who have already approached them. When people are programming, they have so many reasons for choosing programs which are nothing to do with the fact that your music is great or isn't, as the case may be. It's more to do with, I need to have a famous name like, you know, Lachenmann or Stravinsky in the program, and I can have space for one or two names that the public has never heard of, which is the living composer, invariably. Or maybe a couple. Obviously, if it's a contemporary music festival, there's going to be loads of anonymous names, and that's why that's a better situation. So another way of getting to that rehearsal is to make concerts happen yourself. If you have friends who are performers, which I probably already mentioned, contacts in venues and so forth. A lot of composers start a group, one way or the other, either a group of composers who have some performers in association, or a group of performers who have some composers in association. Historically, you may be aware that people like Stockhausen, Peter Maxwell Davies, Steve Reich, maybe Philip Glass, and so forth, have done this at some stage. They would have had a circle of performers, and indeed a few composers. Groups such as Bang on a Can and the Crash Ensemble, and indeed Concord. I think probably every contemporary music group in Ireland would have had either composers starting it or very much in-house composers in the wings who regularly get played. So that is incredibly familiar model and useful. Yeah, and if you can perform yourself up to a professional level on any instrument, of course that's another avenue, and I think really all composers that I know who are such good performers write for themselves from time to time, obviously not always. Other important things would be to be persistent and indeed even sometimes pestering. That is to say, I was talking earlier about follow-up emails and so forth. That's really difficult stuff, but you need to keep track of have I actually spoken to this person more than once? You know, have I spoken to them in person or on the phone, or have I just sent an email? Try and follow things up. I'm using the word pester, but you know, you don't want to be a pest, obviously, but you have to have staying power, and so that's just how it works. Because you will, with opportunities, there's always tons of dead ends and a lack of response and so forth. And there's another good thing to say in that connection, and that is that you would want to have many irons in the fire, because many of them will just turn to nothing. So like, especially if you're looking at something like composersite.org and you're sending out a piece to somebody thousands of miles away in the hope that they will come back and say, wow, we're going to do this. If you have 16 of those, then maybe one of them really will come home. It's a bit like betting on a horse race. If you've actually put a bet on every single horse in the race, that's a bit better, isn't it, than just backing the favourite or the most popular horse. And you need to stay visible and present in people's minds. So it's not a good idea when you're a young composer to move way down to the country like I have actually done at this stage in my life. Because you need to be basically seen. You know, it's a good idea if there's festivals and events and regular concerts that you go and show that you back musicians, you're supporting musicians, you're interested in what your colleagues are doing, and they also know you're a composer and you're around. That's far better than just never being visible or audible or whatever. So you need to stay present in people's minds. Of course, there are other ways of staying present in people's minds on top of that, but they're not a replacement. I'm talking, of course, about having a website and a social media presence. And maybe, if you have the materials, a YouTube channel, some of your music on SoundCloud account and so forth. Just have a think about how people, whether it's performers or curators or whatever, how do they decide? They cannot think of you if they've never heard of you. I mean, that's basically what I'm talking about. So don't assume that they're all combing around looking for websites that are in obscure corners of the internet. You have to have reminded them that you exist, as I say, in person at a concert or via email or something. And of course, other ways of being present and visible are to have membership of something like the Contemporary Music Centre, and where applicable, the Association of Irish Composers or the Irish Composers Collective, or if you're not in Ireland, as some of you are not, any similar kind of composer group. So this naturally leads on to the subject of organisations for new music. I mentioned the Contemporary Music Centre, for example. There are different kinds of organisations for new music. So you have these places which are representative and communicative and maybe shop window places all together, by which I'm talking about the Contemporary Music Centre and in the UK, Sound and Music. Or there may be a page on your composer group that again is a shop window. There's a lot of overlapping areas, but there's that kind. And then there's opportunity creating organisations such as composer groups and ensembles. Particularly ensembles. I mean, after all, you have in Ireland with the Crash Ensemble a regular call called Free State for young, unexposed composers. So opportunities come through those kind of things. Another type of organisation are collection societies. So that is what the Irish Music Rights Organisation here and PRS, the Performing Rights Society in the UK, are. Each country has an equivalent one of those with a different name. What they do is they collect royalties from whether it's radio or perhaps other types of royalties, and then they give it to you. None of these are very much, but they exist, and again, you become a member. Some of these places usually also give out bits of money. There's a thing called the Performing Rights Society Foundation, PRSF, in the UK, where they back ideas coming from composer groups and so forth. The Irish Music Rights Organisation is certainly someone that does have funding. They fund this thing here, the summer school, and I have been known to ask them for travel help from time to time, usually part of your travel expenses, never all. Then of course you have real funding organisations, as I would like to think of them, by which I mean the arts councils. In Ireland, the arts council, and also sometimes city councils and county councils, will give money if you come forth with a project and you fit under one of their schemes that they're currently running. You have to just go and look on their websites and see what's what. The Arts Council is by far the biggest giver of that kind of money in Ireland, totally outstripping anything that county councils would do. Dublin City Council is a very important one to consider. So basically a very large number of people in a city, there may be another stream there, but there's not much else. County councils are quite fond of giving out amounts like 400 or 500 euro, which is extremely limited if you're trying to do anything at all, but especially if it involves a group of people. So they're never part of a full funding package for anything. Other organisations are courses, you know this one obviously. Some very famous courses have been going since time immemorial at this stage. So you have Darmstadt, Donna Eschinger Musiktage, the International Young Composers Meeting in Apeldoorn in the Netherlands, and also there the Galianos Young Composers Week, and in France, Royaumont Voix Nouvelle, which is one thing. These have all been going for years and attract incredibly big names in actual composers, of course, as the lead characters. And they do the same thing as we do, that is to say, I think generally realised scores. They also have an awful lot of musicological discussion and talk and encounters and so forth. None of these organisations, and no other organisation that I haven't mentioned, will really ever act as your agent or publisher. If you want a publisher, they do exist, and they will act as your publisher. The world of music publishing is obviously in decline and has been for, I don't know, hundreds of years, a very long time. But they still exist. Some interesting places to look at are people like Composers Edition in the UK. That's one where it's really kind of run by and for composers, and it's very professional looking. So you might go and look at them online and see. That's the sort of thing worth aiming towards if you're really interested in being published. Of course, most of us in Ireland don't have a publisher, the vast majority of us, and I also know many colleagues who had a publisher but no longer do have one because they weren't particularly happy with the arrangement. So that's something worth thinking about, and that's why I only really mentioned Composers Edition. Obviously, somebody like the Contemporary Music Centre based in Dublin, they are very good at producing scores, and theirs would generally be like comb-bound. This is not a CMC score. I'm not claiming that it is. This is when I want to quickly whiz something together myself using a binder and an acetate sheet and a back sheet and decent program print, and it's So as good as anything, as long as it has all those things, the forces, the year, the duration, the composer, all the other things I mentioned. So, having mentioned collection societies and publishers, that brings me neatly to the subject of making a living. Of course, the first thing I'm afraid to say is that from creative compositional activity, very few people actually do make a living, by which I mean even scraping by on those kind of earnings. There's really no money these days in royalties from radio play or sales of scores or sales of recordings if you're in any way a non-popular field, and even if you are, I'm sure you know, in a popular field, it's also just kind of died in the last 25 years or whatever. So what you find most serious composers and composers of all kinds have is a combination portfolio career. You might have some commissions, which is great, that is good money sometimes, and bursaries, but on top or in addition to that, it would tend to have regular work. Part-time teaching is very common. Obviously part-time music teaching, but it could be other teaching, and indeed casual work. I have known personally composers, colleagues of mine around my own age, who've cleaned out airplanes for Aer Lingus or run a taxi around the city centre of Dublin for years. And we all know there are very famous examples of this, such as Charles Ives, who made millions out of insurance, kept that thing going full time, or Morton Feldman worked, was it in his uncle's haberdashery outfit shop, and every other conceivable example. I mean, Chopin earned his money teaching piano, which is hardly immensely surprising, and didn't make a fortune at that either. Another road which you might be thinking it sounds extremely attractive in comparison with that dreadful disclosure would be a permanent job, say for example in a university music department. As far as I can see, these have been on the decline for decades, and they're not as attractive as you might at first think, which is not to rule them out completely. They tend to leave very little time for composing because obviously you're very busy with all the other activities that you can imagine. And one of the main things about university jobs, if you are looking at music university jobs, you really want to try and land one where they accept composing as a type of research or publication. Well, those are the same thing. Now, there are loads of university posts where the composing portfolio is not regarded as equivalent to publication or research, and I think that you're on a very sticky wicket if you land into one of those. So I would always check out that side of things. Many dedicated composers that I know, therefore, seem to live like students throughout their adult life. That is because of what I already mentioned. They have a portfolio involving part-time teaching which has no incremental structure whatever. And that does mean that they live renting and they move house a bit and they can't have kids maybe, or they can't afford to put them through college. Now, that sounds incredibly dismal, but on the other hand, another very common pattern is that they have this reasonable portfolio that brings in reasonable money, and their partner is somebody who has a better kind of career type job with increments, and then of course you can do all those nice middle class things I mentioned, and that's about the size of it. It's perfectly possible and pleasant to exist as a composer, but you have to go in with your eyes open and with a very flexible, positive attitude and a very good solution-finding focus about life as well as the music itself. But I don't want to sound so completely negative. You have composers on this course, including myself, who are, sane and settled, and you can always ask some of those. You can find more examples of them. Feel free to approach them and ask them all these questions. I would strongly recommend that sort of course of action. Thank you.